Okay, good morning. Time now, minute past 8 a.m. On Thursday, November 28th, 2024, in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Mori. I am a Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize these online morning seminars to introduce the latest World Bank report presented by the authors of those reports to the stakeholders and audience in Japan. Today, we are going to feature the latest report titled Fiscal Vulnerabilities in Low-Income Countries, subtitled Evolution, Drivers, and Policies. We have a pleasure of having Joseph Maweje, who is the economist in the Prospect Group in the Development Economics Vice Presidency of the World Bank, the main author, actually the author of the report. This report was released on October 13th, which is about a month and a half ago, quite new report. So next 30 minutes or so, we are going to listen to Joseph presenting the main point of this report, Fiscal Vulnerabilities in Low-Income Countries. And following his presentation, I'll read the question that we received from the viewers in advance. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please do so by sending your question by the online form posted on the website announcement, or please post your question on the chat screen of the YouTube screen, or you can simply send your question to me by email directly. So I'll read your question on your behalf and ask Joseph to make responses. So with that, I would like to formally invite Joseph to come in to kick off the presentation. Over to you, Joseph. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koichi. I'm very excited to be invited to this event by our, colleagues and stakeholders in Tokyo, Japan. My name is Joseph Maweje. Originally, I'm from Uganda in Africa. And I work as an economist in the World Bank in Washington, D.C., in the Global Economic Prospects Group. And today, I'm very excited to speak to you about a report that we released about 1 month ago that sheds light on some of the challenges that low-income countries are facing as they try to mobilize resources to meet their development objectives. So the report is entitled Fiscal Vulnerabilities in Low-Income Countries, Evolution, Drivers, and Policies. But before I start, I want to share with our stakeholders why we should care about low-income countries and why you should care about their fiscal positions. In short, these countries have extremely large needs, but they have few resources, and urgent action is needed to support them by themselves, also by the international community, right? So we look at 26 of the poorest countries in the world, and these countries have about 40% of the poorest people in the world. So if we are going to make progress on poverty reduction at the global level, these are the countries that we should be looking at. But they are deeper in debt now than at any point in time, and they're increasingly being affected by all sorts of shocks. They are poorer today on average than they were before COVID. And this is because there have been shifts in the global environment, higher interest rates, lower growth. A lot of events have happened since then. The war in Ukraine, some of them have faced wars themselves, but also they have faced natural disasters. And natural disasters tend to have bigger implications in these countries. But when the pandemic came, these countries had heightened fiscal deficits that they have been unable to unwind since then because of the changing global environment. Interest rates went up. Their external positions deteriorated. And suddenly they have to pay a little bit more than they anticipated to pay before. So the increase...
Joseph, Joseph, sorry to intervene. I think we lost you the last, I would say, a minute or so. So if you can just repeat a little bit in the last a minute part of your presentation so that we can sort of catch up. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now, but we lost you like about 1 minute actually.
Okay, all right. I'm sorry about that. So these countries are deeper in debt now than at any point in time because the global environment has changed quite significantly for them. Interest rates went up, their external positions deteriorated, and their exchange rates moved in ways that ensured that they pay higher in interest payments today. But also, when their fiscal deficits went up, they have been unable to unwind them because of the challenges that followed the pandemic, with the war in Ukraine and other challenges. But also, these countries have experienced expenditure pressures amid persistent revenue weaknesses. But these countries can be helped and they can do better. They need to implement well-designed and ambitious policies focused on 4 areas: revenue mobilization, expenditure efficiency. They need to modernize their debt management practices, and they can grow their economies. They can take advantage of certain opportunities to grow, but they also need support, including through AIDA and other international organizations. So that's by way of background. In this presentation, I will aim to answer 4 questions. The first one is, how have fiscal positions evolved in these countries? And the simple answer is that they have deteriorated. What has been the main source of the recent deterioration in fiscal positions? And the simple answer to this is that we have seen expenditure pressures amid increased revenue weakness in these countries. We also look at how different shocks, including global recessions, conflicts, and natural disasters affect fiscal positions in these countries. And I will conclude by discussing some of the policies and support that these countries need to improve their fiscal positions. Now to the first question: how have fiscal positions evolved in low-income countries? What we see in low-income countries is a situation of higher government debt and interest payments, and a larger share of countries falling into debt distress. The chart to the left shows you the increase in government debt in low-income countries, which has been higher than in other emerging market and developing economies. And yet we know that these countries don't have a very high debt carrying capacity. At the same time, what's going on in these countries is that interest payments have increased much higher than in other emerging markets and developing countries. If you look at the chart in the center, you will be able to see that interest payments in these countries on average have exceeded 10%. In some countries, they have exceeded 20% of revenue. This means that these countries have little resources to invest in other important sectors like education, health, climate adaptation, and infrastructure. Now, amidst all these challenges, a lot of the low-income countries, a larger share of them, are in or at high risk of debt distress. The chart to the right shows that not a single country, not a single low-income country, is actually at low risk of debt distress. But why has debt increased so much in these countries over the past few years? We did an exercise that decomposed the changes in debt into its contributions from growth, deficits, interest, and other factors. And what we find is that fiscal deficits have been the highest contributor to changes in debt since 2011, so that they have outweighed the increases from increased growth. But also these countries are paying a little bit more in interest cost. So what we have seen is a broad-based increase in government debt in more than 80% of low-income countries. I will go now to the second question. What has been the main source of the recent deterioration in fiscal positions? As you are going to see, the deterioration has been due to expenditure pressures and revenue weakness. And this is happening at a time when external financing, in terms of both official development assistance and other flows, have declined. The chart to the left shows that in low-income countries, revenue mobilization is actually much weaker than in other emerging markets and developing economies. These countries are able to collect about 18% of GDP of revenue, which is about 11 points lower than the collection in other EMDs, which is about 29%. Because they collect little revenue, they are also not able to commit significant resources in expenditure to meet their development objectives. And yet we know that they have large needs. The chart in the middle, in the center, shows you that low-income countries actually spend far less as a percentage of their GDP than other EMDEs. And this is a function of the amount of revenue they get. So expenditure is constrained by revenue. As a result, these countries have been running persistent fiscal deficits, which were compounded by the pandemic. And in the context of these countries, they have been unable to unwind them. The chart to the right shows you that in 2023, these countries' fiscal deficits were about 2.4%, which is significantly worse than the situation in other emerging markets and developing countries. And this has been the reason for the broad-based increase in government debt in these countries more than in other emerging markets. Now, looking a little bit deeper on what's going on in terms of revenue mobilization that I pointed at in the previous slide, what we see is that the composition of revenue is skewed in some areas, all right? So when you look at the chart to the left, we see that low-income countries don't have enough in terms of, for instance, property taxes, but we also see that grants are declining in these low-income countries. The chart in the middle will show you that these countries are spending significantly more on the wage bill and on subsidies and interest costs. And this tells you that they probably could improve expenditure efficiency through reallocating some of those expenditures. Now, some of those expenditures tend to be rigid, meaning they are not the type that you can easily reallocate, meaning that these countries need to think carefully about improving expenditure efficiency. But there are also other areas they could improve. They have large subsidies and they have large tax expenditures. And the chart to the right will show you that they spend more than 2% in subsidies and tax expenditures that are usually opaque with little transparency and could be better targeted, could be better put to use. So what we looked at also is how fiscal positions in these countries react to the different types of shocks. And we looked at 3 types of shocks. We looked at global recessions, we looked at intense conflicts, but we also looked at natural disasters in these countries. And what we find is the following. 1, fiscal balances deteriorate quite substantially around global recessions, and government debt tends to rise during global recessions by a factor of about 2 percentage points. We do find similar kind of results when we look around conflict events. And this is very important for these types of countries, because we have 26 low-income countries, but about 17 of them are in conflict and fragile situations. And in a number of them, such as Sudan and the others, conflict has intensified over the last couple of years. There are so many channels you can think about how conflict, for instance, can affect fiscal positions in these countries. 1, there is the channel of the damage to human and physical assets. 2, there is a channel through the deterioration of institutions, including revenue institutions, but also institutions that can preserve the functioning of the economy. But you can also think about other areas. A country in conflict is spending a significant amount of resources on defense spending. And we tend to see this going hand in hand with worsening fiscal balances in these countries. So what should these countries do to improve their fiscal positions? Again, by way of summary, they should collect more revenue, they should improve expenditure efficiency, they should modernize their debt management practices, and they should take measures to improve growth. But also, the international community can play a role to provide support and technical assistance to improve the institutional frameworks and fiscal outcomes. In terms of revenue mobilization, there are a couple of things that I want to speak about. The first one is that tax effort tends to be lower in low-income countries than other emerging markets and developing economies. When you look at the chart to the right, you'll be able to see that low-income countries are able to collect about less than 2/3 of their potential. And what I mean by potential is that, considering a perfect world, if low-income countries were able to collect the maximum revenue they could, how much would that be? And if that amount was 100, then maybe they're at around 60%. But we see that there is inefficiency across a range of tax collection. We see that in terms of personal income tax and in terms of consumption tax, low-income countries are less efficient. But this efficiency can be improved by taking a number of measures, including in reducing informality and the adoption of IT to improve domestic tax mobilization. But the other thing that we see in low-income countries is that they have lower spending efficiency. And lower spending efficiency in low-income countries reflects broader governance challenges that may include corruption, but also weaknesses in the system for, public investment management. The chart to the left will show you how low-income countries compare as a percentage of GDP to other EMDEs in terms of, the broader expenditure categories. And we can see that there are differences, across categories. But you have to remember that low-income countries also have low revenue bases, and therefore they spend quite significantly less in absolute terms, even if the amount may look, in terms of GDP, large in some instances. But the thing that I want to show you that is very important this evening is the chart in the middle, spending efficiency. So sometimes these countries are spending much less in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. But the efficiency with which they spend could be improved quite significantly. Low-income countries are very inefficient in their expenditure, and this points to challenges of governance that I spoke about. The chart to the right will show you the major correlates of this expenditure efficiency, and you are going to see that with corruption, lack of law and order, and internal conflict, some of these factors explain why we see lower spending efficiency in low-income countries. But we also see challenges with debt management and institutional quality. And one of the biggest challenges is weak transparency, and especially in monitoring and reporting. Now, some progress has been made. The charts here will show you the number of countries that meet the minimum debt management assessment performance, which is a measure which is compiled and assessed by the World Bank. You will see that across a number of measures, so few countries are actually making progress. But the good news is that the blue bars are pointing to a higher number than the diamonds, meaning that there has been some marginal improvement. But when you look at the chart, for instance, to the right, you'll see that in some cases, it's just one or two countries that are making, that are meeting the minimum requirement for debt transparency. And this is very important because when countries are not transparent, they tend to end in a crisis. An example is Mozambique in 2016, where a lack of transparency and contraction of debt off the books led to an economic crisis. But these low-income countries also are highly vulnerable to a number of shocks that complicates their fiscal outcomes. The chart to the left will show you that the cost of natural disasters, on average, over the past 10 years, is higher in low-income countries than in other EMDEs. And yet, these countries also face higher climate adaptation costs relative to other EMDEs. The chart in the middle will show you that it's about 3.5%, and yet for lower middle income countries, it's less than 1%. Precisely, the countries that don't have the resources actually need them the most. This is the takeaway from this slide. The chart to the right will emphasize this point. The bars shows you the amount of resources expressed as a percentage of GDP that these countries were able to commit in response to the COVID shock. Low-income countries, less than 1%. Other EMDEs, nearly 3%. So these countries, highly vulnerable to shocks, but they don't have the means to protect themselves. But these countries also have some advantages they could take advantage of, but they also have some other challenges. Because of the challenges we have discussed, economic progress in these countries has stalled. When we look at the income per capita in these countries, it has been declining relative to other EMDAs since 2000, so that by 2023, the average income in a low-income country is actually about 1/9 of the income in other EMDEs. And this is not income in in advanced economies, in other EMDEs. At the same time, the grants as a percentage of income coming to these countries has been declining to about 5% in 2022 compared to about 10% a year earlier. At the same time, IDA, which is the arm of the World Bank that provides cost-effective support to these countries, has more than doubled its contributions to these countries in terms of income since 2015. But again, given that these countries need a lot of resources, IDA alone is not enough. But these countries have certain advantages that they could take advantage of. They could take advantage of potential demographic dividends as the rest of the world sees a slowdown in population. These countries will be the reservoir of the working population of the future. But they also have other resources, including resources that are critical for the energy transition as the world gravitates towards green energy. These countries have the minerals and all other resources that they need to supply the green transition. But they need to improve in some areas to take advantage of that. And this is the point that I have been speaking about the resources that these countries have and about the demographics. But I need to emphasize that these countries have a lot of work to do to turn these opportunities into tangible benefits on the ground. They need to build robust institutions and well-implemented frameworks to harness the benefits of natural resources, but they also need to invest in their people to ensure effective health and education and to build human capital. So in the presentation today, I looked at 4 questions. In the first one, I looked at how fiscal positions have evolved in low-income countries, and we saw that fiscal positions have deteriorated, and even more sharply since the pandemic. What have been the main sources of the recent deterioration in fiscal positions? This reflects expenditure pressures and revenue weakness in the context of external financing and official development assistance, which is declining. We have also seen that adverse shocks and especially global recessions and intense conflict are associated with weaker fiscal positions. And in terms of policies, low-income countries need reforms to support tax policy and tax administration, to improve expenditure efficiency, to modernize their debt management, and to improve growth. The international community can complement these reforms with greater financial support, but also tailored technical assistance and policy advice to improve fiscal outcomes in these countries. Let me stop here. Thank you so much. I welcome any questions or comments. And if you go to the website of the World Bank Prospects Group, you'll be able to see all the other material and publications that we have. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Joseph, for your presentation summarizing the main findings, main point of the report. Thank you very much. So we received some questions in advance. Let me read those questions in order. And some of them actually are the points that you sort of covered during your presentation. But let me read so that you can, emphasize the points that you really need to focus on. First one, in your analysis, what types of technical cooperation should be placed in order to help the low-income countries to overcome the current physical challenges? What would be the role of the World Bank and the other international organizations in this regard? So the first question to you, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is This is a very important question, speaking to the role of the World Bank in terms of technical support. Now, I need to emphasize that country circumstances matter. Not all low-income countries are the same. And therefore, knowledge of a country is extremely important to be able to design the kind of technical support that is tractable in these contexts. Let me give an example. You have low-income countries that are in fragile and conflict situations that I spoke about. And we saw that fiscal positions tend to deteriorate even more severely in these situations in the presentation. Now, for such countries, the most important thing is to support the growth and development of institutions and institutional frameworks that can safeguard the gains made in these countries. It's extremely important that countries are supported to improve on their public investment management aspects. This is extremely important. PFM is very important. And any support should come with policy advice to do this. So when we say support, it doesn't necessarily mean, the money, but also what I'm going to call the hand holding for some of these countries. And this is extremely critical because these are countries that are at the lowest level, one, of development, two, of capacities and capabilities to be able to do things, and they need a lot of hand holding. And this is where institutions like the World Bank come in because they can provide money that is patient, that is, let me say, free or low cost interest. But the most important thing is that it comes with a base of knowledge. So these countries need this kind of mix of technical support, financing, and policy advice, but is tailored towards building their institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your point. So let me read the second question. Would you please comment on the importance of the International Development Association, IDA, in terms of the physical vulnerabilities in low-income countries? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important question. IDA can play a critical role, first, by mobilizing resources, working with the private sector to improve the amount of resources available for these countries. Low-cost financing, extremely important. But IDA can also support in other areas. And for me, these are the more important areas. To build the capacities of these countries, precisely in the areas that we have discussed right now, right? Domestic resource mobilization is very important. And I think IDA is very active in this area, working with revenue organizations and the ministries of finance in these countries to come up with the policies and strategies and frameworks on how to generate your own revenue. For me, I think this is very important. Two, IDA can work with these countries to improve the frameworks for expenditure efficiency. We spoke about public finance management. We spoke about public investment management. How do you select a project? How do you appraise it? How do you do monitoring and evaluation? How do you ensure that you get the best value for your investments? And I think IDA is working with the authorities across so many countries to improve in these areas. Another area that IDA could work is to improve, the architecture, the frameworks for debt and debt management. And we see also improvements in these areas. So IDA can play two critical roles, all three. The first role is to provide cheap financing, which is very critical for these countries. The next one is to support the development of institutions and frameworks in these countries. And the third is to provide the policy advice and to share the knowledge across the world. I think these are very critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. So next question. How does the improvement of public procurement procedures, including the need for capacity building of the procurement agencies, fit into the issues related to lower spending efficiency in the low income countries? So this is a question to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is another extremely important question. And we have discussed today extensively spending efficiency, which speaks to how you allocate your resources, but also how you follow the money. Procurement is an issue that should be prioritized, and it's an area where I think the bank and other international financial institutions are actively working with the authorities in these areas. One of the areas where there's a lot of leakage and therefore inefficiency, we can use this technical jargon to say inefficiency, but you can actually say leakage of financing, right? It is in procurement. And I think that AIDA and the bank have projects that are supporting the authorities to improve their PFM, public finance management systems, precisely to improve in these areas. Improvements in PFM should go hand in hand with improvements in public investment management, starting from when a project is identified to the last stage when a project is implemented, and everything in between, and all the procurements done in between. If that is done, then a lot of resources can be saved for these low-income countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question, which is an interesting question actually to ask you. Do you see the positive signs of the betterment of the vulnerabilities in debt and fiscal management in the low-income countries? Over to you.
Thank you very much. I think that you can look at low-income countries and you're actually able to see some improvements over time. But these improvements have not kept pace with the needs on the ground, which have been compounded by the crisis of the last 5 years. I think this is where the biggest challenge is. Low-income countries can actually collect more revenue, and I think they're beginning to pay more attention to issues of efficiency. And we see that their citizens are actually demanding for more accountability. If I can go back to one of the slides that I showed earlier, I hope I'm able to get to it quickly. It's this one. Let's say in the area of debt transparency, there's a lot of weaknesses there, right? But we see that the blue bar, which points to the most recent assessment, is actually in most cases longer than the diamond, the yellow diamond. That shows you that there is some improvement in this area. Well, you can still see few countries are doing well, but there is some improvement in this area. Yes, there are improvements in a number of areas, but these countries need even more support to accelerate those improvements because the needs are high and they have been growing even more given the challenges that these countries have faced over the last couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for responding to the questions. Lastly, I would like to ask you about your next research, your future research, given that you have just published this very interesting topic, physical vulnerabilities in low-income countries, and you are part of the prospect group in the DEC, constantly producing the JEP report, etc. So what are the plans ahead of you in terms of analysis on issues related to this topic, but also more broader in your radar screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. So more broadly, the prospects group looks at issues on commodities, on fiscal policy, on monetary policy in emerging markets and developing economies. Our biggest mandate is to produce twice every year the Global Economic Prospects Report, which gives an assessment of the trends more broadly in the global economy, which starts at the global economy and then can look at regions and so on and so forth. If you're familiar with our work, you know that it comes out every year in January and in June. But we also produce the Commodity Markets Outlook, which comes out every April and every October, looking at a broad range of commodity markets in energy, in minerals, in agricultural commodities, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the work plan that is related to this topic, I can specifically talk about what I am working on, because I am hoping that I will be invited again to speak to our stakeholders. So we are working on another report that follows this, again, with a focus on low-income countries, but we are looking at what it will take for them to achieve higher income levels, basically to graduate to middle-income countries. Again, looking at these 26 countries, but also drawing experiences from countries that were low income in 2000 and have since transitioned to middle income countries. So this is a report that is going to come out next month, but will also be featured in the January 2025 Global Economic Prospects Report. So please stay tuned, and I look forward also to the opportunity to speak to our stakeholders about what we have in this report.
Great, thank you. So with us this morning, connecting from Washington, was Joseph Maweje, who is an economist in the Prospect Group of the Development Economics Vice Presidency of the World Bank, presenting the latest report issued about a month and a half ago, Fiscal Vulnerabilities in Low-Income Countries, Evolution, Drivers, and Policies. And Joseph, thank you very much, but we certainly would want to come back to you asking for presenting the newest report, which is coming out very soon on the latest topic. Till then, thank you very much, Joseph, once again, and then see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Thank you very much. See you next time, everyone. Thank you for watching.